Hey everyone, today is 6 tips to help stop your highlights from clipping in your landscape photography. So when we take a shot, we've got dynamic range in our image, and that means we've got light areas and dark areas, and you use metering in your camera to try and get the right exposure so that you haven't got anything too bright or too dark. But that can be difficult, particularly with landscape photography when you've got bright skies and darker foregrounds. When you've got areas that are too bright and they blow out completely and become bright white and there's no detail there, we call that highlight clipping. So today I'm going to give you 6 tips to help you reduce that clipping. So I've come today to Agden Rocher, at least I think it's pronounced Rocher, it's French for rock. The locals might call it something different, but I'm in the Peak District anyway, and I've got this composition set up. It's not the composition that I ideally wanted, but there are lots of sheep hanging around and we've got Otis, so got to keep him on the lead and hopefully he doesn't run after the sheep. But I'm going to be getting some shots of this and talking about the tips to help you reduce those highlights or reduce the clipping in your highlights. Tip 1, shoot in good light. So try and avoid the middle of the day. That's when you've got the most intense light, and when you've got really bright sun you're going to really struggle to control those highlights. It's better, if you can, to get out during golden hour, so that's in the morning or in the evening, an hour after or an hour before sunset or sunrise. As you can see here, it's sunset time. We've got quite soft low light. We are still going to have some issues with the highlights blowing out, but it won't be as bad as if it were in the middle of the day. Tip 2, think about the metering mode you're going to use. So that is how your camera exposes the scene. You could use matrix metering, that'll try and work out an average so that your highlights and shadows are kind of balanced, but it might still blow out some of those highlights. So I would recommend switching to spot, and then you can move around your little square on the camera. If you've got it in the sky, it'll expose the sky properly, but you'll have a dark foreground. If you move that over your foreground, that'll be exposed properly, but you'll have a blown out sky. So you'll want to move it over your sky to expose for that. That will mean that your foreground is too dark, but we can fix that if you're shooting in RAW. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And if you're using a Nikon, and I think also maybe Sony cameras can do this as well, there's a metering mode which will help preserve highlights. So it's got a little dot like the spot metering, but with an asterisk to the side, and that will help make sure that your highlights are not blown out. So tip 3, use the histogram in your camera. Using the display functions, you should be able to turn on a histogram, and I'm not going to go into major detail about what that is, but it's basically like a bar chart to represent all the dark and light areas of your scene, and all of the bars to the left of the histogram will represent the shadows, and then you'll move across until you get to the highlights on the right hand side. And depending on how high those lines are, is how bright or dark the shadows or highlights are. So if you're looking at your histogram and you see you've got everything pushed to the right, you know that you've got too many highlights and they're going to blow out, particularly if they're reaching the top. If they reach the very top of the histogram, that means they're blowing out. So you can dial back your settings, either your ISO, your exposure compensation, aperture, shutter speed, whatever it is, do what you need to do to dial those back so that you've not got too many of the bars on the right of the histogram clipping out of the top of the histogram area. Tip 4, try using a grad filter. So I talked a little bit about using graduated ND filters in a recent video, and I'll put a link up top to that if you haven't seen it. But basically, they have a darker area at the top of the filter, fading out into a transparent area. And that means that you can put this dark area over your sky. It will reduce the highlights there, but your foreground, which is in the transparent area, will remain the same. So you can expose for your foreground, get that right, and hopefully your highlights won't be clipping in the sky. Tip 5, always shoot in RAW. You can get so much more detail back in your image when you shoot in RAW. It contains much more information about the scene, about the shadows and the highlights. So if you've got something that looks slightly blown out or your shadows are too dark, you can sometimes bring those back using post-processing software. It's important to note though that you can bring more detail back in the shadows than you can in your highlights. So I recommend exposing for your highlights, making sure they're not blown out or clipping, and then you can bring up the shadows in post to try and balance out your image. Just remember though that you will get noise introduced into the shadowed areas when you bring those up in post. You can try and reduce that using your software by using noise reduction. Okay, so as you've probably realised, the weather is completely nuts. It's just way too windy. So we're going to do tip 6 back at home. I'll see you there. So quite challenging conditions. My initial composition was going to be looking out over Agden Reservoir, and that would have been much closer in the frame. But I hadn't predicted all of those sheep being there, and having to keep one eye on Otis meant that I needed to compromise, and the composition I ended up having was looking out, I think, over Dale Dyke and Strines reservoirs. So that wasn't optimal, and coupled with the high winds, it was a real challenge. But I did still manage to get some images, so that was good, and I can always go back on another day. I might even get the drone up that day. It was way too windy to get it up this time. So there's one more tip to give you. That's tip 6, it's bracketing your shots. So I'm not going to go into this at length because I've made other videos on this, and there's a link up top here if you want to go back and watch this one. But the basic idea is that you take a number of shots, usually between 2 and 5, and you combine those to create an image which has got more dynamic range than each individual one has. So for example, you might take one shot with your sky exposed properly without the highlights being blown out, but your foreground's probably too dark. And then you might have another shot where your foreground is exposed properly, but perhaps your sky is blown out. And then you would combine those together in your post-processing software so that you've got the best of both worlds. You've got your sky properly exposed and your foreground, and that creates a really nice balanced image. And obviously the more shots you have to combine, the more information you have there and the more dynamic range you've got in that image to play with. So this has been 6 tips to help you stop clipping your highlights, to stop blowing them out, and to preserve the detail in those bright areas in your image. If you found it useful, or if you've liked the video in any way, please just give me a thumbs up down below. That really helps out with the algorithm and gets the video out there and stuff. And if you watch every week, or if you're a subscriber, massive thanks for that, I really do appreciate it. But if you are new to the channel and you're not yet subscribed and you'd like to do so, you can just click down there on the big red button, or over here on this picture of me, and that way you'll keep up to date with everything I'm doing each and every week. There's a new video every Sunday morning at 10 AM UK time. So I hope you'll join me next week for the next one. But until then, thanks a lot everyone, and bye for now.